They say the West was won with grit and gunpowder. But sometimes, all a man has left is the dust of his memories and the fire of his rage. Before we watch a good man burn, only to rise from the ashes as something terrifying, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. You are about to witness the birth of a legend, forged in the heart of a tragedy. The world of 18-year-old Ethan Hayes was measured in seasons, not days. It was a life painted in broad, simple strokes, the deep ochre of the earth after a rare spring rain, the endless, bleached blue canvas of the Arizona sky, and the shimmering silver green of the cottonwood trees that drank from the creek running through their valley. Red Creek Ranch wasn't large, but it was theirs. It was an island of life carved out of the unforgiving desert, a testament to the sweat and sinew of his father, Abel Hayes. Abel was a man forged from the same earth he worked. He was quiet, with a strength that lay not in his words but in the steady, calloused hands that could calm a spooked horse or mend a broken fence with equal patience. His eyes, the color of faded denim, held a deep and abiding respect for the land. "It doesn't give, Ethan," he'd often say, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. "It only lends. You treat it right, and it'll see you through." The heart of their home was Sarah, Ethan's mother. Where Abel was the stoic earth, she was the desert wildflower, vibrant, resilient, and filling every corner of their modest wooden homestead with a warmth that defied the harshness outside. Her laughter was as clear as the creek water, and the scent of her baking bread was the first and last promise of every day. Ethan was a reflection of them both. He had his father's resilience and his mother's gentle spirit. His hands were already beginning to show the calluses of a rancher's life, but his heart remained as open and untroubled as the vast plains that stretched to the horizon. His future felt as solid and predictable as the sunrise. He would work this land, raise a family, and one day, pass it on, just as his father would to him. It was a simple dream, but it was everything. The dream ended at dusk. They appeared as apparitions on the western ridge, a dozen riders black against the bleeding canvas of the sunset. They didn't ride like cowboys or travelers. They moved with the slow, predatory purpose of wolves closing in on a fold. Ethan was splitting the last of the firewood when he saw them, the axe freezing mid-swing. A cold dread, alien and sharp, coiled in his stomach. His father stepped out onto the porch, the old Winchester held loosely in the crook of his arm. It wasn't pointed, it was simply there, a part of him. "That's far enough," Abel called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. The riders fanned out, their horses kicking up plumes of dust that glowed orange in the fading light. Their leader trotted forward. He was a bull of a man, dressed in a black coat to fine for the desert, his face a mask of smug arrogance. A thick cigar was clamped between his teeth. This was Silas Thorne, a man whose name was spoken in hushed, fearful tones across the territory. He bought land with ink when he could, and with blood when he couldn't. Abel Hayes, Thorne boomed, his voice dripping with condescension. He gestured with his cigar to the valley around them. "You've been squatting on my property for too long. I've come to collect." "This land ain't yours," Abel stated, his voice flat and unmoving as a slab of granite. "My deed is filed and legal in Prescott. Now, I'm telling you as a neighbor, turn your horses and ride out." Thorne let out a short, ugly laugh that sounded like rocks grinding together. "Deeds can burn, old man." He pulled the cigar from his mouth and pointed its glowing tip at Abel. "This valley has water. My cattle need it. I gave you a chance to sell. You refused. Now, I'm taking it." From inside, the screen door creaked open. Sarah stood there, her face pale, her hands twisting in her apron. "Abel, please," she whispered. Thorne's dead eyes flickered to her, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. He saw her fear, and it fed his arrogance. That was his signal. "Now, boys," he said calmly. The world shattered. The unified crack of a dozen rifles ripped through the twilight peace. Ethan saw his father jerk backward, the Winchester clattering to the wooden porch as red blossoms bloomed across his chest. Abel didn't even cry out. His face was a mask of shock, his eyes finding Ethan's for one last, fleeting moment before they went vacant. A primal scream tore from Ethan's throat, a sound of pure, animalistic agony. He dropped the axe and lunged forward, his mind a white-hot void of rage. He didn't even feel the splintering pain in his shoulder as a bullet grazed him. He was a force of nature, a son's grief made manifest. He crashed into one of the riders, pulling the man from his saddle. They hit the ground in a tangle of limbs. Ethan's hands, the same hands that mended fences and tended to livestock, found the man's throat. He squeezed, the world narrowing to the terrified, bulging eyes of the man beneath him. Then, a boot connected with his ribs, sending a starburst of agony through his side. Another caught him in the jaw, and his head snapped back, his teeth clashing with a sickening crack. He was dragged to his feet, held by two of Thorne's men. He was forced to watch as Thorne himself dismounted and walked calmly onto the porch, stepping over Abel's body as if it were a log. Sarah backed away into the house, a sob catching in her throat. "No, please." Thorne followed her in. There was a single, muffled gunshot. And then, silence. A silence more profound, more horrifying than any scream. Ethan sagged in the men's grip, a sound escaping his lips that was no longer human. The fire in him had been extinguished, replaced by a cold, black nothingness. Thorne emerged from the house, wiping his pistol on his sleeve. He walked over to Ethan, studying the boy's face with a look of detached curiosity. He saw the tears mixing with the dust and blood on his cheeks, the utter desolation in his eyes. "Look at him," Thorne sneered to his men. "Got his daddy's fire, for all the good it did him." He raised his pistol, the barrel cold and heavy as he pressed it against Ethan's forehead. Ethan stared back, not with fear, but with a hatred so pure it was almost a physical force. Thorne hesitated, a flicker of something perhaps amusement in his eyes. He lowered the gun. "No," he said, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face. "A bullet's too quick. A waste." He nodded to his men. One of them slammed a pistol butt into Ethan's temple. The world exploded into a shower of black stars, and his knees buckled. As he fell, a final, searing pain erupted in his abdomen. A gunshot, not to kill, but to maim, to ensure a slow, agonizing end. His face hit the dirt. The last things his fading consciousness registered were the mocking laughter of the men, the smell of kerosene as they splashed it on his home, and Thorne's final, chilling words echoing in the darkness. "The coyotes can have what's left. Let the desert claim him." Then came the roar of the flames, the great, hungry beast devouring his world, his family, his entire existence. And then, mercifully, there was only blackness, deep and absolute as the grave they had left him in. Pain was the first country he returned to. It was a merciless land with a sun of burning iron and a sky of suffocating blackness. For a time that had no name, hours, or maybe Dasithan drifted on a feverish tide, pulled between the jagged shores of consciousness and the deep, silent abyss of nothingness. When he surfaced, the world was a sensory hell. The sun was a hammer against his eyelids. The thirst was a living thing, a rasp of sandpaper and broken glass in his throat. The air, thick with the stench of charred pine and something sickeningly sweet, was fire in his lungs. He was a feast in the making. The carrion birds knew it. He could hear the dry, papery rustle of their wings and their occasional, impatient clicks as they circled above, black specks in a merciless sky. He was no longer a boy. He was merely meat, waiting for the dessert to finish its butchery. In the haze, memories came not as thoughts but as physical blows. The splintering crash of his father's chest. The final, terrified whisper from his mother. The wet, hollow sound her body made as it fell. The glint in Silas Thorne's eyes, not of anger, but of casual, bored cruelty, the look a man gives a bug before he crushes it. These images were the ghosts that haunted the fever dream, relentless tormentors that offered no peace. He prayed for the blackness to take him, to swallow him whole and end the agony. But the desert did not claim him. Something else did. A shadow fell across his face, a momentary eclipse of the brutal sun. It was followed by the scent of dust, old leather, and something herbal, like crushed sage. A water skin, cracked and dark with age, was pressed to his cracked lips. Water cool and tasting of the earth trickled into his mouth. It was the most profound relief he had ever known, a baptism that momentarily washed away the fire. Through a slit of a swollen eyelid, he saw a face. It was a face that seemed to have been carved from the canyon walls themselves, all deep crevices and sun-baked leather. A tangle of grizzled gray hair and beard-framed eyes that were startlingly pale and clear, eyes that had seen too many seasons and decided they were done with the world of men. The man moved with a slow, deliberate economy, his hands surprisingly gentle as they probed the gunshot wound in Ethan's side. "Well, now," a voice like stones grinding in a dry creek bed rumbled. The buzzards will have to wait for their dinner. The man, whose name was Jedediah, had long ago divorced himself from civilization. He was a ghost of a different sort, a former gunslinger who had seen the bottom of enough whiskey bottles and dug enough graves to last 10 lifetimes. He had retreated to these badlands decades ago, content to talk only to the wind and the lizards, his skills now used to set the broken leg of a coyote or tend to a sick hawk. He had been tracking a mountain lion when he saw the plume of black smoke from the Hayes Valley. He'd arrived too late for the living, but just in time for the dying. He saw the boy, half dead and covered in flies, and saw a flicker of something he recognized, a soul that had been burned down to the bedrock. He saw himself, a lifetime ago. Without another word, Jedediah cleaned the wound with a practiced and flinching hand, packed it with a poultice of chewed herbs, and bound it tightly with a strip of cloth. With a grunt of effort, he hoisted Ethan's limp form onto the back of his placid, long-suffering mule and began the slow journey back to his world. Jedediah's home was not a home at all. It was a burrow, a hovel dug into the side of a sun-blasted canyon, a place to exist rather than live. For weeks, it was Ethan's purgatory. He threshed in a fever-fueled delirium, his cries echoing off the stone walls, pleas for his mother, curses aimed at Thorn, guttural sobs of pure, animal grief. Jedediah tended to him silently, forcing bitter, foul-tasting teas down his throat and changing the dressings on his wounds. He was not a nursemaid, he was a mechanic, grimly working to keep the boy's mortal engine from sputtering out. "Don't you die on my floor," the old man rasped one night, as he held Ethan down during a particularly violent fit. "It's a chore to drag a body out in this heat." Finally, the fever broke. One morning, Ethan awoke to a world that was quiet and still. The pain was no longer a roaring fire but a landscape of dull, throbbing aches. He sat up, his muscles screaming in protest, and looked around the small, dusty cavern. Jedediah sat by the entrance, sharpening a knife, the rhythmic shing-shing-shing of steel on stone the only sound. He saw a wooden bucket of water by his cot. With trembling hands, he leaned over and looked at his reflection. The face that stared back was not his own. It was a stranger's mask of bone and taut skin. But it was the scar that held his gaze. A jagged, angry line ran from his cheekbone to his jaw, a permanent mark left by the pistol whipping. It was a map of his new world, a geography of ruin. He traced it with a shaking finger, but the most profound change was in his eyes. The open, gentle warmth of the boy who had loved the smell of rain on dry earth was gone. In its place was something else, something cold and hard, and empty as a mineshaft. It was the look of a house that had been burned to the ground, where nothing would ever grow again. In that moment, staring at the ghost in the water, he knew. The boy named Ethan Hayes had died in the fire with his parents. In his place, a specter had learned to breathe. And all it breathed was hate. Recovery was not a gentle slope towards healing, it was a brutal, vertical climb up a cliff face of jagged rock. The first weeks after the fever broke were a testament to the body's stubborn refusal to die. Every movement was a negotiation with pain. Sitting up sent a dizzying wave of nausea through him and made the wound in his side scream with a fresh, hot fury. Standing for the first time was a monumental effort. His legs, atrophied and weak, trembled like newborn colts, and the world swam in a gray, hazy vortex before his eyes. Jedediah offered no sympathy. His was a harsh and practical brand of medicine. He would leave a canteen of water and a piece of hard, dried jerky just out of Ethan's reach. "If you want it, get it," he'd rasp, his back already turned as he tended to his snares. The world don't bring things to a man laying on his back. Frustration, then a cold, simmering anger, became Ethan's fuel. He would grit his teeth, the muscles in his jaw bunching, and drag himself across the dusty floor of the cave, every inch of victory paid for in agony. The first time he reached the canteen, his hands shaking so violently he spilled half the water, he didn't feel relief. He felt a grim, hollow triumph. He was not just surviving, he was conquering his own weakness. His days fell into a Spartan rhythm, dictated by the sun and his own growing resolve. He would force himself out of the cave at dawn, his body screaming in protest, and walk. At first, he could only manage a few dozen yards before collapsing, his lungs burning, his side a riot of fire. But each day, he pushed a little farther. He walked until the pain became a familiar companion, a constant, low hum beneath the surface of his thoughts. He learned to exist with it, to harness it, to turn its sharp edges into a whetstone for his will. His silence was a wall he built around himself, brick by painstaking brick. Jedediah, for his part, seemed to prefer it. They coexisted in the vast, empty quiet of the canyons, two ghosts haunting the same space. But the old hermit watched the boy. He saw the way Ethan's eyes would track the flight of a hawk, not with wonder, but with a cold, analytical focus. He saw the way his hands, once gentle, would clench into fists at a sudden noise. He saw a boy methodically erasing himself, leaving behind something sharp and dangerous. One afternoon, Jedediah was cleaning his prized possession, an old but meticulously cared for Colt peacemaker. The gunmetal gleamed with a dull, deadly light. Ethan, who had been staring into the fire for the better part of an hour, stopped, his eyes fixed on the revolver. The sight of it stirred something in the black, still waters of his soul. It was a tool. It was an answer. He walked over, his steps now steady and sure. He stood before the old man, a shadow falling over the gun. "Teach me," he said. The words were not his own. They were rusty and used things, torn from a throat that had forgotten how to speak. It wasn't a question. It was a demand. Jedediah slowly looked up, his pale eyes meeting Ethan's. He saw the abyss there, the utter lack of light or warmth. He had seen that look before in the mirror, many years ago. "That's a fool's path," Jedediah said, his voice low. "Leads to nothing but a pine box or a rope. I've walked it. There ain't no redemption at the end of it, boy. Only more ghosts." Ethan's expression didn't change. The scar on his cheek seemed to darken. "The ghosts are already here," he replied, his voice a flat, dead thing. "I just need to learn their language. Teach me." Jedediah saw the futility of arguing. The boy's soul was a locked room, and vengeance was the only key. To deny him would be to deny a starving man a scrap of bread. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime of regrets, he slowly, deliberately, pushed the Colt across the flat rock between them. "The gun is not the weapon," Jedediah began, his voice taking on the tone of a grim sermon. "You are. The steel is just a way to make your will felt at a distance." The training was a brutal catechism. It began not with shooting, but with the gun itself. Ethan spent days disassembling and reassembling the Colt, blindfolded, until his fingers knew every pin, every spring, every grooved chamber by heart. He learned its weight, its balance, until it felt not like a tool in his hand, but a part of his own anatomy, an extension of his arm. Then came the draw. Jedediah made him practice the motion 1,000 times a day, from sunrise to sunset. It wasn't about speed. Speed is for frightened boys trying to prove something, the old man rasped. The draw is about economy, about certainty. No wasted motion. From leather to hand, from hand to eye. It's a single, perfect thought. Ethan's body, hardened by his relentless walking and ranch hand muscles, adapted. His draw became a fluid, terrifyingly calm motion. There was no flourish, no bravado. It was simply the movement of a predator striking. Finally, they began to shoot. Jedediah set up targets: tin cans, stones, the occasional unlucky scorpion at varying distances. "Don't aim," he'd command. "Look. See the target in your mind. The hand will follow. Breathe out. Squeeze. Don't pull." The roar of the Colt was a shocking violation of the canyon silence. The first shots were wild, but Ethan was a terrifyingly quick study. His rage, his grief, all the roiling chaos inside him, he learned to channel it down the length of his arm, through the steel, and into a single, focused point of lethal intent. The gun became his meditation. In the moment before he fired, the screaming ghosts in his head fell silent. There was only the target, the sight, and the cold, clean purpose. As his skill grew, he knew the final piece was missing. The boy named Ethan Hayes was a liability. His face was a memory. His name was a weakness. He needed to bury him completely. He found what he was looking for in the charred ruins of his home, a place he had forced himself to return to one grim afternoon. Sifting through the ashes that had once been his life, he found a piece of his father's saddle, scorched and stiff but largely intact. The leather was thick, dark, and smelled of smoke and loss. Back in Jedediah's cave, by the light of a flickering fire, he worked the leather. He cut it, soaked it, and shaped it. It was a simple, brutalist design, a mask that would cover the upper half of his face, from his brow to the bridge of his nose. It would hide his eyes, the windows to a soul he no longer wanted anyone to see. It would obscure the jagged scar that marked him. It was not a disguise. It was a new face. It was his tombstone. When he was done, he tied it on. The leather was stiff and cold against his skin. He looked at his reflection in the bucket of water. The boy was gone. The stranger with the haunted eyes was gone. In their place was an icon of faceless dread, a blank slate upon which the world could write its fears. From that day on, he was no one. The whispers would begin months later, carried on the wind from one dusty, desperate town to the next. Tales of a silent rider in black who dealt in lead and left only corpses behind. They wouldn't know his name, his history, or his purpose. They would only know the stark, terrifying visage of the leather mask and the natural calm with which he killed. They would call him the masked gunslinger. He was a ghost, forged in fire and grief, and his hunt was about to begin. The path of vengeance began not with a roar, but with a whisper. In a town called Perdition, a place that lived up to its name, smelling of stale beer, cheap perfume, and desperation, Ethan found his first target. He wasn't looking for a name. He was looking for a memory. He sat in the darkest corner of a saloon, a glass of untouched whiskey before him, his masked face a void that swallowed the dim, smoky light. He listened. For weeks, he had drifted from one wretched outpost to the next, a silent phantom, learning that ghosts hear more than men. He found it in the drunken boasts of a card sharp named Cletus. A fat, sweaty man with shifty eyes, Cletus was celebrating a small win by regaling his table with tales of his more glorious, violent past. Rode with Thorn himself, he slurred, spitting tobacco juice near the boot of a nervous-looking patron. Cleaned out a whole valley. The old farmer thought a shotgun could stop us. Fool. Ethan's body went rigid. The low hum of the saloon faded into a dull roar in his ears. He didn't move, but his focus narrowed on Cletus with an intensity that was almost physical. He remembered Cletus. He remembered the high, wheezing laugh the man had let out as his father fell. He waited. Patience was a lesson the dessert had taught him well. He waited until Cletus, drunk and fumbling with his winnings, stumbled out into the moonless alley behind the saloon. The alley was a narrow throat of darkness between two dilapidated buildings. Cletus was fumbling with his trousers when Ethan's voice, a low rasp of disuse, cut through the night. "You have a memorable laugh." Cletus froze, spinning around. All he saw was a tall, dark silhouette, the upper half of his face an unnerving blank slate of leather. "Who the hell are you?" he stammered, his hand instinctively going for the pistol tucked in his belt. "I'm a ghost," Ethan said, taking a slow step forward, the sound of his boots on the gravel like the counting of seconds. "I'm here to collect a debt from Red Creek Ranch." Recognition, followed by pure, animal terror, flashed in Cletus's eyes. His face, slick with sweat, went pale. The memory, buried under months of whiskey and grime, resurfaced. The burning house. The boy. Cletus's drawl was a clumsy, panicked scramble of flapping hands. Ethan's was a whisper of motion. The cold peacemaker seemed to materialize in his hand, a seamless extension of his will. The gunshot was a flat, brutal crack that echoed off the brick walls. Cletus was thrown backward, a look of stupid surprise on his face, a dark hole appearing in the center of his chest. He slid down the wall, leaving a wet smear, and was dead before he hit the ground. Ethan stood over the body, the smoke from his pistol curling in the cold night air. A memory, sharp and unwanted, pierced through him. His mother, humming softly as she kneaded dough, her hands covered in flour. The memory was so vivid it was painful. He had expected satisfaction, or release. Instead, there was only a deeper, colder emptiness. The first name was crossed off a list that only existed in his mind, but the ledger of his own soul felt no lighter. He holstered his pistol and melted back into the shadows, leaving only a corpse and a spreading pool of darkness. His hunt led him north, to the booming, corrupt mining town of Silver Creek. The name was a lie. The only thing of value being pulled from the ground was coal, and it coated the town in a permanent layer of black dust. Here, he learned his next target wore a badge. Marcus Thorne, Silas Thorne's younger cousin, a man with a cruel streak and a love for easy violence, was the town's deputy. He remembered Marcus, a weasel-faced man who had held his arms while Silas delivered the final blows. Killing a lawman was a different game. A back alley execution would bring the full weight of the territory down on him. This required something more than a fast draw. It required cunning. For weeks, Ethan became part of the town's grimy scenery. The masked gunslinger was a silent observer, gathering whispers in saloons, watching the deputies' operations from the shadows of rooftops. He saw how Marcus used his badge as a shield for extortion, shaking down prospectors and merchants, his justice for sale to the highest bidder. The law in Silver Creek was just another weapon for the wicked. Ethan found his leverage in a young, frightened stable hand who had seen Marcus murder a prospector over a disputed claim. The boy was terrified, but his sister had been a victim of Marcus's unwanted advances, and in that soil of fear, a seed of courage was planted. Ethan didn't threaten or cajole. He simply spoke to the boy, his masked face unreadable, his voice a calm statement of fact. He will not stop. You know that. Armed with the boy's testimony, Ethan set his trap. He anonymously informed a visiting circuit judge of the murder, providing details only a witness would know. Then, he confronted Marcus. Not in an alley, but in the center of the dusty main street as the sun reached its zenith. Marcus Thorne, the gunslinger's voice boomed, stopping everyone in their tracks. You're a murderer and a thief. I've come to deliver a warrant the law is too cowardly to serve. Marcus, flanked by two of his thuggish cronies, laughed. Big words from a man in a Halloween mask. You're under arrest for vagrancy. Your time is done, Ethan said, his voice dropping. A witness has spoken to the circuit judge. Your badge is just a piece of tin now. Panic flickered in Marcus's eyes. He saw the faces of the townspeople watching, their usual fear now mixed with something else, hope. He knew the game was up. His only way out was to kill the accuser. The street fell silent. The three men faced the lone figure. It was an unfair fight, and everyone knew it. But they had underestimated the ghost. Marcus and his men drew as one. But their 3 shots were a clumsy, panicked volley. The gunslinger's draw was a single, fluid motion. 3 shots erupted from his Colt in a terrifyingly fast, precise sequence. BNG, BNG, BNG. The 2 cronies fell where they stood. Marcus staggered back, clutching his chest, his pistol falling into the dust. He looked down at the spreading stain, then up at the masked face, a look of disbelief on his own. It was just business, Marcus rasped, sinking to his knees. It was my family, Ethan replied, his voice cold as a grave. He watched Marcus topple over into the dust. The townspeople stared, a mixture of awe and terror on their faces. He had freed them, but he had done it with a killer's calculus. He turned without a word and walked away, the legend of the masked gunslinger growing with every step he took away from the town he had just, in his own dark way, saved. The trail grew colder. Thorne's remaining men had scattered like rats from a sinking ship, terrified of the ghost that was hunting them. Ethan's search took him into the harsh, desolate expanse of the salt flats, a place where the sun bleached the very memory from the land. His target was a man named Elias Vance, the oldest of the crew, the one who had set their home ablaze. He found him not in a town, but in a squalid, isolated cabin on the edge of the flats. There was no fight. When Ethan kicked in the door, his Colt leveled, he found Elias not with a gun in his hand, but with a blood-soaked rag pressed to his lips. The man was dying, his body being consumed from the inside out by consumption. He was a skeletal figure with haunted, fever-bright eyes, the once feared gunman reduced to a wheezing wreck. Elias looked at the mask and started to laugh, a wet, gurgling sound that turned into a hacking cough, spattering the grimy bedsheets with fresh blood. So, the ghost came for me after all, he gasped, his voice a fragile whisper. I heard you were coming. Knew you would. Ethan stood there, the gun feeling heavy and useless in his hand. The rage that had been a constant fire in his gut felt confused. There was no monster to slay here, only a pathetic, dying man. Thorne, Ethan said, his voice hard. Where is he? Elias seemed to find some final, grim satisfaction in the telling. He's a king now, he rasped. Bought a whole town. Calls it redemption. Can you believe that? Silas Thorne, dealing in redemption. He coughed again, a long, body-racking spasm. He's got politicians in his pocket, a private army. Thinks he's untouchable. But he's scared. I heard it in his last letter. He's scared of you. Of the boy he left for the coyotes. Elias's eyes, burning with fever, locked onto Ethan's mask. Do you know what I remember about that night? The smell of the kerosene. The way the fire sang. It was the most beautiful and terrible thing I ever saw. A tear, thick and slow, traced a path through the grime on his cheek. We're all damned, boy. Him, me and you most of all. You're carrying the fire inside you now. Ethan lowered his pistol. There was no victory here. Killing this man would be like kicking a dying dog. It would be a mercy. He couldn't give him that. He turned and walked out of the cabin, leaving Elias to his ghosts and his disease. As he rode away, the man's weak, coughing sobs followed him, a sound more haunting than any gunshot. Vengeance, he was learning, was not a clean fire that purified. It was a smoke that choked, that stained everything it touched, leaving behind nothing but the taste of ash. Redemption was a monument to Silas Thorne's ego. It wasn't a town that had grown, it was one that had been built, with a new saloon, a large courthouse, and at its center, a grand, two-story mansion for Thorne himself. Armed guards patrolled the streets, their presence a constant reminder of whose law held sway. This was Thorne's kingdom, and Ethan was the plague at its gates. He couldn't ride in as the gunslinger. He needed to be invisible. He sold his horse, bought worn-out prospector's clothes, and entered redemption as just another down-on-his-luck drifter. He took a room in a boarding house and spent his days observing, his mask tucked away, his face partially hidden by a low-brimmed hat. He learned Thorne was no longer just a land baron, he was a politician, courting respectability. And he had a new family. He was courting a widow who ran the town's general store, a gentlewoman named Elena. She had a young son, a boy of about 10 named Leo. Ethan watched them from afar. He saw Thorne playing the part of the charming suitor, buying Leo candy, ruffling his hair. The sight was a vile perversion, a grotesque parody of the family he had stolen from Ethan. Yet, watching the boy, Leo, stirred something dormant and painful inside him. He saw in Leo's wide, innocent eyes a reflection of the boy he used to be, a boy who believed the world was good and just. His presence, however, did not go unnoticed. A silent, watchful drifter was a threat in a town built on secrets. One evening, 2 of Thorne's guards cornered him in an alley, but before they could act, they were distracted. Leo, chasing a stray dog, ran straight into the alley. One of the guards, a brutish man Ethan recognized from that night, grinned cruelly. He grabbed the boy. "Well, look what we have here," he sneered, pressing the barrel of his pistol to Leo's head. "You been watching us, drifter. Now you're gonna tell us why, or the widow's gonna have another funeral to attend." Time stopped. The cold, calculating killer in Ethan screamed at him to walk away, to not compromise the mission. But the ghost of the boy from Red Creek Ranch, boy who loved his mother, cried out. He didn't think. He acted. He moved with a speed that was not human. Before the guard could react, Ethan's hand shot out, grabbing the man's gun hand and twisting it with a sickening crack of bone. He slammed the man's head into the brick wall, then spun, drawing his own hidden Colt as the second guard fumbled for his weapon. A single silence showed a muffled thud and the second guard collapsed. The first, his arm broken, could only stare in horror before a swift, brutal blow to the temple sent him into unconsciousness. It was over in 5 seconds. Leo stood frozen, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. Ethan knelt before him, his face still in the shadows. "Go home, son. Forget you saw this." Leo nodded, speechless, then turned and ran. Ethan knew he had made a fatal error. He had shown his hand. He had saved an innocent, but in doing so, he had awakened the dragon. The hunt was no longer his. He was now the hunted. News of the attack spread through redemption like a fever. The 2 guards, one dead and one with a shattered arm and a concussion, were proof that a wolf was inside the fold. Thorne was not a fool. He immediately connected the incident to the ghost who had been hunting his men across the territory. The drifter was the gunslinger. The town transformed overnight. It became a fortress. More guards appeared on the streets, their rifles held at the ready. A curfew was imposed. Checkpoints were established at the town's entrances. Thorne was turning the screws, locking down his kingdom to trap the phantom that haunted him. Ethan was now a rat in a cage. He was forced to abandon his room at the boarding house, slipping out in the pre-dawn hours. He became a true ghost, moving through the alleyways, sleeping in haylofts, living off stolen scraps. The entire town was now the hunting ground, and he was the prey. Thorne, enraged and paranoid, began to show his true colors to the townspeople. His guards became more brutal, their searches more invasive. The mask of the benevolent leader was slipping, revealing the tyrant beneath. He was squeezing his own people, hoping to force Ethan out into the open. But Ethan used the lockdown to his advantage. He became the whisper in the dark, the source of Thorne's growing paranoia. He would strike at the periphery, a silent, deadly force. A guard on patrol would be found at his post with a knife in his back. A supply wagon would be found with its horses scattered and its driver vanished. He never showed himself, never fired a shot that could be heard. He used the skills Jedediah had taught him, not just the gun, but how to read the land, how to move without a sound, how to become one with the shadows. He was waging a war of terror against an army of thugs. Thorne's men, already bullies and cowards at heart, began to crack. They started seeing ghosts in every shadow, flinching at every unexplained noise. They started drinking more, their trigger fingers getting itchier, leading to fights amongst themselves. Thorne's control, built on fear, was being eroded by a greater fear. Ethan watched from the rafters of the livery stable as Thorne, standing on the balcony of his mansion, screamed at his men below, his face purple with rage. He saw the fear in Thorne's own eyes, the fear of the unknown. A storm was brewing, both in the sky and in the town. Dark, heavy clouds were gathering on the horizon, mirroring the storm of violence that was about to break. Ethan felt it in the air. The time for hiding was over. The time for ghosts and whispers was past. The final confrontation was at hand. The storm broke with the fury of a vengeful god. Rain fell in solid, wine-whipped sheets, turning the streets of redemption into rivers of mud. Thunder cracked the sky, a percussive prelude to the violence to come. It was the perfect cover. Ethan moved through the storm, a wraith cloaked in rain and darkness. The guards, huddled in doorways for shelter, never saw him coming. He moved like a phantom, using the thunder to mask the sound of his movements, the lightning flashes to illuminate his path. 2 guards at the gate of Thorne's mansion died without a sound. He didn't enter through the front door. He scaled a rain-slicked trellis to the second-floor balcony, the same one where he had seen Thorne screaming at his men. The French doors were unlocked. He slipped inside, the Colt in his hand feeling like a block of ice. The house was a temple of stolen wealth, filled with plush carpets, fine furniture, and oil paintings. It was all paid for with his family's blood. He moved through the silent, opulent rooms, a specter of vengeance in a sinner's palace. He found Thorne in his study. The room was dominated by a massive oak desk and a wall of leather-bound books he knew Thorne had never read. Thorne was standing by the fireplace, a glass of brandy in his hand, staring into the flames. He was not a monster of myth. He was just a man, older now, thicker in the middle, his face lined with the stress of the past few weeks. "I knew you'd come tonight," Thorne said without turning, his voice calm. "The storm. It's fitting." "Get away from the fire," Ethan said, his voice low and dead. Thorne turned slowly. He studied the masked figure, his eyes filled with a mixture of arrogance and curiosity. "So, you're the ghost who's been costing me a fortune in manpower," he said, taking a sip of brandy. "Who are you?" "Some do-gooder. A bounty hunter." "I'm the boy you left for the dessert," Ethan said. He reached up with his left hand and slowly, deliberately, pulled off the mask. The gaslight from the lamps flickered across his face, illuminating the jagged scar, the hollow cheeks, and the ice-cold, dead eyes of a man who had been to hell and brought a piece of it back with him. For the first time, Ethan saw true fear on Silas Thorne's face. The arrogance vanished, replaced by a dawning, horrified recognition. The brandy glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor. "The rancher's boy. It can't be. You told the coyotes to have what was left," Ethan said, his voice a low growl of pure, distilled hatred. "They didn't want me." Thorne's fear was quickly consumed by rage. "So the whelp came back," he snarled, his hand darting inside his coat for the pistol hidden there. But Ethan had been waiting for this moment for years. His entire existence had been honed to this single, perfect point in time. Thorne's draw was fast, but it was the draw of a man afraid to die. Ethan's was the draw of a man who already had. The Colt bucked in his hand. The roar of the gun was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet caught Thorne high in the chest, spinning him round. He crashed against his desk, scattering papers, his eyes wide with the ultimate surprise. He looked down at the blood blossoming on his fine white shirt, then back at Ethan. "You?" He gasped, a bloody froth on his lips. Ethan walked forward, his gun still leveled, and stood over the man who had destroyed his world. He looked into Thorne's dying eyes, expecting to feel a surge of triumph, of release, of justice. He felt nothing, just a vast, hollow, echoing silence. The fire that had driven him for so long, that had consumed his entire being, had just burned its last piece of fuel. And now, it was out. The gunshot, loud as it was swallowed by a deafening clap of thunder. For a long moment, the only sounds in the room were the drumming of the rain against the window panes and the gurgling last breaths of Silas Thorne. Ethan stood over the body, the mask dangling from his left hand, the smoking pistol in his right. The face of his enemy, now slack in death, offered no answers, no peace. The great monster of his life had been reduced to a bleeding piece of meat on an expensive rug. The mansion doors burst open. Elena, the widow, and her son, Leo, stood there, their faces pale with terror, drawn by the sound of the gunshot. They saw Thorne's body, and then they looked at him. They saw not a savior, but a killer. They saw the scar, the cold eyes, the gun. Leo, the boy he had saved, looked at him not with gratitude, but with the same fear he had shown Thorne's thugs. He hid behind his mother, peering out at the man who was both his rescuer and a terrifying specter of violence. In the boy's eyes, Ethan saw his own reflection, and the truth crashed down on him with a weight far heavier than any grief he had ever known. He had won. He had avenged his family. But in the process, he had become the very thing he had set out to destroy. He was a creature of the shadows, a man whose only language was violence, whose only purpose was now a corpse at his feet. He had not resurrected his past. He had only become its most permanent ghost. Jedediah's words echoed in his mind. There ain't no redemption at the end of it, boy. Only more ghosts. He had destroyed Thorne, but Thorne had won. The land baron had taken Ethan's life that fateful night, and this long, bloody road had just been the slow, drawn-out process of his dying. Without a word, he turned his back on the body, on the woman and her child, on the town of redemption. He slowly raised the mask and tied it back in place, letting the familiar leather hide the emptiness in his eyes. The mask was no longer a tool. It was his true face now. He walked out of the mansion and into the cleansing rain. He didn't look back. He found a horse in Thorne's stable, a strong black stallion, and saddled it. He rode out of town, not as a hero riding into the sunset, but as a phantom melting back into the storm. He left behind the legend of the masked gunslinger, a story that would be told in whispers around campfires for years to come, a tale of a silent, faceless avenger, a hero to some, a demon to others. But no one would ever know the name of the man behind the mask. No one would know he was just the son of a murdered rancher, a boy who had been left for dead, and who had spent the rest of his short, tragic life proving that some men, when they come back from the grave, leave their souls behind. He rode on, not towards a new dawn, but deeper into the endless, starless night.